Visited us for a month before we adopted her, and we'd already had a trip to go up to the Smoky Mountains planned, and we had to rearrange that a little bit. But we stayed at this condo, and they have this really nice indoor water slide thing, and we're about 5 minutes from Dollywood, and so she came with us, and then we went to, on the way back, we stopped in Chattanooga for one night, did some things in Chattanooga. And I just remember, that was the end of the first, we got back, it was like the end of the first week, because we kind of left right after she got in, we left pretty quickly after that. And every week we'd have to fill out this report that the hosting agency had you fill out, and asking about, okay, are there any behavioral issues, or what about this, what about that? And then it gets to the point where it says, are you going to still want to consider to adopt her? Because we had said yes, we were interested in adopting her if things worked out with the hosting. And there was the question: are you still interested in adopting? And Lauren looked at me, and I looked at Lauren, and we're like, after the behavior that we went through in that time period, and what a terror she was, we're like, are we still committed to the vision of adopting her? And we had to look through that behavior and say, you know what, there's somebody we can love. And I still have to do that today, because I get mad sometimes when she doesn't maybe live up to my standards. I have to remind myself that she's a year removed from an orphanage where, she didn't get the love that she needed. But anyway, why I say that is we don't love her because of what she's done. We love her for who she is and how God's brought her to us. And I say that about Israel. It's not how great they are. God didn't love them because they were great. He loved them because He chose. They're a chosen nation, the chosen people. He chose them, and so it's not about we look at the actions, and I think that's where the early church went off. Well, they rejected Christ, the temple's destroyed, they're dispersed. How can they still be God's chosen people? The facts don't line up with the Bible, So now we got to reinterpret the Bible in terms of the facts. So anyway, I just love that scripture here, and it really says that's God's perspective. Now, if you go read a little bit further after that, he talks about how they were just totally disobedient. But again, that's God's heart, and that was their actions. And now we'll go back to this, review this a little bit, and we'll continue to work through this every week and kind of review. We talked about the four different aspects of where, the periods of time that I call it. They're not really dispensations per se, but they're really, we see how God's working. We see Genesis and Exodus is kind of the preparation for how did Israel become a nation? What is its history? It's kind of like, people do family trees, and Lauren has an uncle who's put this whole book together on their family, and he just loves to study that. And if we have a new child, he wants you to send them information and just document. And that's what kind of Exodus and Genesis and Exodus is kind of that. Well, how did we get here? Type of thing. Moses is writing that to Israel to explain to them. Well, here's why you're here. Here's why you're here in the Sinai. Here's how you got here. It brings it up to the king. God gave the law to Moses. He said not to have a king; he would be their king. And really, we have the kingdom. We kind of have the kingdom in its theocracy. God ruling from above. He's here, he's in the temple and in the tabernacle there, but he's ruling through men in a sense. And then we'll work through the captivity, really the breaking of the covenant, the Mosaic covenant. They broke His law, and we'll go through some of the verses in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. This is what was going to happen if they broke the law, and then idolatry. So they went into idolatry. So where did God send them? God only has a sense of humor. You want idolatry? I'm going to send you to the center of idolatry. And that's what they did. And really, you don't really find that as a huge issue in Judaism today, although there is a sect, if you've heard of Kabbalah, It's very mystical, and that can lean towards more idolatry. But they don't really have that same fascination that they had when they went into Babylon. And we talked about how that started the king, the four great, after the captivity, the four great Gentile kingdoms, and we're really still in that stage of the times of the Gentiles. Jesus says the times of the Gentiles wouldn't end until he returns, and we see the different aspects of that. And then the last period of time from the Old Testament is that time when the Messiah, Jesus, is reigning and ruling from Jerusalem. And that's kind of like the high point of Old Testament Scripture is the Lord ruling and reigning. But let's go back a little bit. And I always try to... I'm very much one for... How can we understand the pattern of Scripture and see how God's moving and understand things in a very simple way? I'm not the one who came up with this, but I thought it was really great. 4 events of Genesis and the four main people of Genesis. So if you know these 8 things, if you remember these 8 things, you'll remember a lot about the book of Genesis. Does anybody know the first major event that we talk about in Genesis? Creation. What would be the second major event? Anybody? Fall. Anybody? What's the next major event after the fall? Flood. And then what's the next major event? Anybody? Babel. See, you guys know it. And really, that takes 10 chapters, right? What is that, 49 chapters in Genesis? Right? So really, all this time goes by, and you have four main events. And it's almost like Babel, God's almost like saying, I'm done now. And now, okay, man's had his way, and now my plan's I'm gonna stop to show you my plan. And he stops dealing with the world as a whole, and what does he do? He picks out one man. Who does he pick out? Abram. Then it becomes Abraham. So then we have 4 people. So we have Abraham, who else? Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. If you know those 8 things, if you can know a little bit about those 8 things, you know pretty much the book of Genesis. Okay? So, and then I added 4 things, since to keep it in 4s. I said, okay, what can we know about, what 4 things do I see in Exodus? Well, what do we have? We have slavery, right? And then we have Moses is raised up, right? We see Moses raised up, God raises up Moses. We see the Exodus, right? And then we see really the Mosaic covenant, given it the law, the Mosaic covenant. So if you know those 12 events, it kind of lead you up to how did the nation of Israel get there in Sinai. So, and we'll move through each week. We'll move through a little bit more of that, but really that's kind of the preparation for the nation of Israel. Those 12 things kind of highlight that. Another chart that I got, and I know I sent Matt the. How's that? There you go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
There was a I guess an author, but pastor named Clarence Larkin, and he created tons of these different charts, and I sent Matt the link to it. And here I just found one that he did on the Jews, and you can kind of see it's really where I'm going. They're passed in the law, law and grace, but you see how the times of the Gentiles kind of transcends that time. Starts under the law, but it finishes up under grace, which is kind of there, and then we see their future, which is the millennial kingdom. So this is kind of, again, some broad overview of Israel past, present, and future. The past is the law, grace now, and the future is the righteousness in the millennial kingdom. Anyway, just if anybody would like this chart, I can bring it next week if you want to look at it in more detail. But I thought that was really nice. What is a covenant? We talked about this last week. Covenant, it's also in the Hebrew, it's called Brit. There's different Hebrews. There's biblical Hebrew, which when I always hear things pronounced, I'm like, boy, that sounds a little bit different. Then there's Ashkenazi Hebrew and Sephardic Hebrew, which Sephardic is probably closer to biblical Hebrew. The Ashkenazi Hebrew is spoken by more Ashkenazi. Its pronunciation is by Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi Jews are more from the German, Russian, Eastern European descent, and most Jewish people in America are are of the Ashkenazi descent. They mainly came out of, and that's due to persecution in those areas. Lauren and I are both Ashkenazi. And then there's Sephardic, which pronounces things slightly different. That's why I say some people pronounce it Brit, some people pronounce it Bris. It's still to this day a very important, like I said, very important concept. We see it in the wedding ketubah. We also see it there's a ceremony performed on the 8th day, and it's called Brit Milah, or we just call it Bris or a Brit. You might hear it called that, the circumcision. And that really is it really comes under the Abraham. I mean, it's under the Abrahamic covenant, and it's reiterated again under the Mosaic law. So, I mean, I take that the Abrahamic covenant is still in effect today, and so, I felt that when Micah was born, it was, we were still binding upon us to have that done. And we actually had it done by what's called a moil on the eighth day, and Lauren was able to find somebody who did that, and we went through the rituals, and we had a big celebration. I don't know why, but that's what they do. But anyway, I'm just saying that this concept of covenant, kind of like football, a little bit different, but skin is involved. But one's kosher, one's not. Anyway, enough with it. A covenant is a contract. We talked about conditional versus unconditional. We'll see more of that. We talked about the suzerain vassal treaty. Does anybody remember that? Who's the suzerain in these types of treaties?
God.
God. The greater is the suzerain. The vassal is the one that's kind of like the subject. And we talked about 4 characteristics of the unconditional covenants. They're literal, eternal. Really, they depend upon God, ultimately, and then we'll see that as we go through it. The nation of Israel still has to has some responsibility, but the ultimate fulfillment of it, we'll see, I believe, comes through Jesus, fulfills all the covenants. And so, Jesus does what Israel could not do for itself. He does for them. And he made, again, the covenant with the covenant people, Israel. So this is kind of all in review. Now we'll get to this chart here for a few minutes. We'll spend about, does anybody not have this chart? Kind of put this together back at Genesis Bible Church when I taught a class on the Jewish people, and I was kind of working how do all these covenants fit together, and I looked at what we have: unconditional, conditional, eternal, temporary. So you kind of see that, and we'll see through where we start out with the Abrahamic covenant and how that's more spelled out in some of the other covenants. And then I said, well, how are these fulfilled? And really, when you start to look at it, it's really, we'll see this, really Jesus who fulfills these covenants for the nation. Who's the son of David who sits on the throne? Who's the one who provided the new covenant? So, and ultimately, who's going to take the land for them? Jesus. So so ultimately, the fulfillment of the covenants are really dependent upon, Jesus is going to do that. And then really, we'll talk about this, the real fulfillment of these covenants really doesn't happen till the millennial kingdom. So yes, they were put into effect when they were given, but really the fulfillment of them we do not see the fulfillment of these scriptures, and we'll go through that. We do not see the fulfillment of these scriptures until the millennial kingdom. So again, it's really the covenant. God gives the covenant with Israel, but He's still the one who fulfills that, and that's neat. So anyway, we talked about a covenant as a contract. Christianity is and the Judeo-Christian is unique. Other religions don't have this, where their God actually enters into a contract with the people. What do you usually see in these religions? It's usually the God lording it over people, right? And they're living in terror, and they've got to sacrifice things to their gods. And there is a sacrificial system of course, in the scriptures. But really, it's this relationship through the covenant that makes Christianity unique. And